back to physiology. Glad you're here for today's discussion, introduction to the central nervous system. Okay, so central nervous system. A lot of this you know, but as usual, we're going to be layering things you already know with new information. So, first part, so what is the central nervous system? So CNS stands for central nervous system. It's composed of the brain and the spinal cord. So it's exactly like it sounds. It's the central nervous system. So it runs down the center of your body. So the brain here, and then the spinal cord, which is this central structure, not all the little parts coming off. All the parts coming off, those would be the peripheral nervous system, and we will talk about those later. But the central nervous system is made up of just the brain and the spinal cord. And even with just only those two structures, there's quite a lot to talk about. So what is the spinal cord? We're talking about the spinal cord today. And it's this cylinder of nervous tissue. You can see this image here. So starting here at the base of the brain, it's a cylinder of nervous tissue. How do you spell cylinder? Cylinder, it's an ER. Cylinder. And it runs from the brainstem, so that little place where I marked right here, that's the brainstem. So it runs from the brainstem all the way down into your sacrum. And the sacrum is this bone down here, sort of at the base of your vertebral column. Okay. It's around 20 inches long in adulthood. As I'm sure you know, a child's would be smaller, and it's about a half inch in diameter. So if you were to measure, it's a cylinder, so it's like a tube. And if you measured across it, it's about a half inch, which I think is a pretty good size. It's protected by several structures. As you imagine, this is a cylinder of nervous tissue. This is how the brain connects with the rest of the body. And so it's really important that it's protected. And you're aware of that because you know, if you've heard of spinal injuries before, that's a really big deal. So it's protected by a couple of things. So protection by the vertebral column. So that column of bones that runs down your back, if you put your hand back there, you can feel the spinous processes sticking out. They have essentially a hole that runs through them that the spinal cord runs through. So the vertebral column is protective. And then there are what's called meninges. And you've probably heard of this before because you've probably heard of meningitis before. And meningitis is an infection of the meninges. So what are meninges? Meninges are layers of connective tissue that protect the central nervous system. So right now we're talking about the spinal cord. And on this image, I'm going to label the different meninges. So the outermost meninges It's kind of this green color on your image. It's called the dura mater. I've also heard people pronounce it mater. Sorry, it's one T. The dura mater, which might be more accurate. I'm not sure. Outermost layer of connective tissue that's protecting the spinal cord. So that green layer on the outside, notice it goes all the way around, protects the entire spinal cord. Would be the dura mater or dura mater. And then the next layer, it's not super obvious because it's pretty thin, but it's this just deep to the dura mater or dura mater. Is the arachnoid mater or mater. So you've got dura mater and then the next layer, so laying right on top of each other, dura and then arachnoid. And then the next layer is the pia mater or pia mater. And that's this sort of pink layer. And you'll notice that there's a space. So between dura and arachnoid, there's no space. They lay right on top of each other. But between the arachnoid and the pia, there's a space. And in this image, it's that sort of blue color. And this is fluid. Okay, this is the subarachnoid cavity. This blue space, this sort of light blue space, is the subarachnoid cavity, and it's filled with fluid. And this is probably something that you also, if you stop and think about it for a second, is familiar. So this blue space is the subarachnoid cavity. And it's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And the cerebrospinal fluid is another protective structure, a shock absorber. And it also bathes the spinal column in nutrients. So this fluid flows along the length of the spinal column. So you've got each of the meninges, and then you have cerebrospinal fluid that's also bathing the spinal column. All protective structures for what's actually happening in that center area. So I'm going to switch to another image. So all of this stuff that I drew on here is still there. I just don't want to get an overly crowded image. Maybe. There it is. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so all of the stuff that I showed you before, that's protective, right? We're protecting the nervous tissue that's at this at the center of the spinal column. So if we look at this middle part here, I'm going to circle it in yellow. This middle part is the actual spinal cord. Remember the other color, the other things are layers of meninges and then the cerebrospinal fluid. So just that middle part, that's sort of like gray and then dark gray center, that's the actual spinal cord. And it has different sections, as you would imagine, that do different jobs. Sorry, I'm sick today and my ear is all clogged. I apologize if I'm sounding funky. Okay. So the part that's the lighter color is all white matter. So this part that's this sort of light gray color, I'm trying to find a color that matches it. All of this light gray is white matter. And then all of this dark gray that's in the center here is gray matter. So we're just in the spinal cord. I'm going to put my circle back. So we're only talking about things inside this yellow circle right now. White matter and gray matter. The The gray that's coming out on either side, we're not talking about those yet. The white matter has tracks. So these are the tracks that connect information going to and from the brain. So you have ascending tracks and descending tracks, as you might imagine, depending on where we are in the spinal cord. So we could be really up close to the brain, we could be way, way, way down near your hips. So the spinal cord has to have a way to communicate with the brain and then to pass messages on to lower structures. And so it does this via the white matter. So we're going to focus right now on the white matter. And the white matter has ascending tracks and descending tracks. So I'm going to draw these here. So this sort of green that I'm drawing, that I'm outlining here in the white matter, these are ascending tracks. They're the ascending tracks of the white matter, okay? So there are ascending tracks there are ascending tracks here, and then there are a couple little spots in other places. So these are all, if ascending tracks, think about that for a second, they're going up. So where do you think that they are heading? They're heading to the brain. So you have these ascending tracks, and what the ascending tracks are is that they're groups of axons traveling, carrying those action potentials from whatever level they are in the spinal cord. They're carrying those action potentials up to the brain. So they're going to talk to the brain. Those are the ascending tracks, okay? Carrying information to the brain. Okay. Then of course we have to get information from the brain. If you're going to move, if you're going to have some sort of action, you need the brain to give you that information. And so then those are the descending tracks. That's a good color. Okay. And so your descending tracks, and this isn't, of course, exclusive. I'm not drawing every single possible descending track here. Your descending tracks, I'm drawing in blue, in this sort of dark blue color. Your descending tracks, as you would expect, bring information from the brain. So all of these blue are the descending tracks. And again, descending tracks are groups of axons carrying action potentials, bringing information from the brain. So these are the ways that the level of the spinal cord that we're looking at. So if we went in and we took a section of spinal cord, that's basically what we're looking at, is we went in and we cut the spinal cord and we turned it like we're looking down the tube. That section of spinal cord, that little spot, the way that it communicates with the rest of the body is through the white matter, through the ascending tracks and the descending tracks of the white matter. Okay. So to understand kind of the next section of stuff that we're going to talk about, we need to go back and think about the organization of the nervous system. So we have the nervous system as a whole. All the parts, pieces of the nervous system. And remember, we have sort of our major divisions here. We have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So CNS and the PNS. Central nervous system is our focus right now. And as we just discussed, the CNS is the brain and the spinal cord. Okay. The spinal cord takes in information from the peripheral nervous system and sends information out to the peripheral nervous system. This is essentially its job. So we have all of these neurons out in the periphery, and those all have to bring information in or take information from the spinal cord. And so we're going to touch on the peripheral nervous system a little bit so that you'll understand what we're talking about when we're talking about how the spinal cord integrates that information. So the peripheral nervous system can be divided into motor neurons and sensory neurons. So we have motor and sensory. So as you'd expect, motor neurons are going to carry information from the spinal cord, go do something, motor. Sensory neurons are going to take information from the periphery into the central nervous system. Then our motor division is further divided into two different types. There's somatic and autonomic. Somatic and autonomic. And if you stop and think for just a second, autonomic sounds like automatic, and that's exactly what we're talking about here. This is involuntary responses. The autonomic nervous system is involuntary responses, and there are two divisions here. This is the parasympathetic and sympathetic. Okay. Parasympathetic is rest, digest. Sympathetic is fight, flight, or freeze. Why am I telling you all of this? Because we're going to be talking about integration at the level of the spinal cord, and that the integrating information is coming from the peripheral nervous system. So autonomic you can think of that as like automatic. So these are the things that you don't have conscious control over. Somatic are the things that these are your voluntary movements. So these are the things that you do have control over. And different parts of the spinal cord integrate these different pieces of information. So this is all motor. So you have parts that integrate the somatic and parts that integrate the autonomic. And then you also have parts that integrate sensory, so incoming information. And then motor would be outgoing information. Okay, so these are the parts of the peripheral nervous system which we're going to dig into. I promise we're going to talk about all of this in a lot more detail, but I'm just giving you kind of an overview right now because we're going to be talking about this with regard to integration at the level of the spinal cord. Okay, so we talked about our ascending tracts and our descending tracts. So ascending tracts and descending tracts are how this information gets to and from the brain, to and from the spinal cord. Okay, but how about the spinal cord actually bringing information in from the rest of the body? That's what we're going to talk about now. So if we look at, again, we're still in this right now, this central structure here. And we talked about the white matter. Now we're going to talk about the gray matter, the different parts of the gray matter. If we are orienting ourselves in our drawing here, this is dorsal and this is ventral. So stop and think for a second, orient yourself. What part of the body is where? What does dorsal mean? What does ventral mean? Because the areas of the gray matter are named based on where they are in the body. So are they on the dorsal side or are they on the ventral side? So this part on the dorsal side, these structures here are the dorsal horns. And then you've probably guessed that if those are the dorsal horns, these are probably the ventral horns, and you are correct. Okay, you've got the dorsal horns and then the ventral horns. Sticking off, I shouldn't have circled that whole thing. Hang on, I'm going to fix that. Should have just circled this part for ventral horns because you also have lateral horns. Sticking off over here are your lateral horns. So you've got Based on just, if you know your orientation and direction, you are golden. So you've got dorsal, ventral, and lateral. Okay, and these dorsal, ventral, and lateral sections of the gray matter do different things. They integrate, they bring in, they receive information from different parts of the peripheral nervous system. So that's the gray matter. And the parts coming out of that in this image, so these sort of gray things sticking out, those are actually the nerves. Okay, so these are the spinal nerves coming off. So this central part, these are our horns of our gray matter, and then these structures coming off of that are what's called spinal nerves. Those are the spinal nerves. A spinal nerve is a gathering of axons. So it's not just a single axon, it's a whole bunch of axons. So if we were to take one of these spinal nerves and we were to cut it in half and look down it like a tube, which is kind of a theme for us, I think. Let's see. What you would see is if we took it and we were looking down like a tube. This is our tube, and we look down it. Here's our eyeball right here. And we look down that tube. What we're going to see is a bunch of axons gathered together into a nerve. That's what a nerve actually is it's a whole bunch of those axons all carrying action potentials, but all gathered kind of into a bunch. And that's what those, in this image, that's what those gray structures are that are coming off of the gray matter of the spinal cord. Okay. So which part of what is doing what is kind of an interesting thing to think about. So the dorsal horns receive somatic or receive sensory information. Okay. So these are incoming, right? Information coming in from the body. So dorsal horns are receiving sensory information. From the body. Okay? Receiving sensory information. These are the dorsal horns on both sides. They are receiving sensory information, sensory input from the body. And what happens, that sensory input comes in, and this is a whole bunch of axons, right? A whole bunch of axons coming in, bringing in information. So what they're going to do is those axon terminals are going to then synapse with the dendrites of neurons in the dorsal horn. So this is where the first exchange of information happens. I don't know if I should say first. This is where an exchange of information happens. So the dendrites, the receiving ends of all of those neurons that are going to take that information up to the brain, exist in the dorsal horns. So you've got all of that connection, all of that synapse happening there with regard to sensory information. Okay, so we've got sensory information coming in at the dorsal horns. So you probably guessed, because you are very capable and bright, that the ventral horns are then carrying motor information. The ventral, yeah. So from the ventral horns, you get motor information coming out. So motor information leaving leaving the spinal cord and giving commands out to the body. That's coming from the ventral horns. Okay, information coming from the ventral horns. So whereas in the dorsal horns, you've got an axon terminus talking to a cell body, right? The dendrites of the cell body. So you've got cell bodies hanging out here, axon terminus coming in talking to the cell bodies, and then that information going up to the brain. It's just the opposite in the ventral horn because information's going in the opposite direction. So here you have make that a little bit shorter. You have information going out to the body, right, rather than coming in. So then what has to receive that is here you've got the dendrites of the neurons that are going to form the nerve that are going to leave the body hanging out here in this ventral horn. Here they are, ready to receive synaptic transmission. And so then what's bringing that information then are the axon terminals of neurons coming from the brain, information coming from the brain. So this is from the brain, and this is to the brain. So what the gray matter of the spinal cord is doing is it's the place where that synaptic transmission happens. It's the place where information coming from the body gets transferred and goes up to the brain, or information coming from the brain gets transferred and goes out to the body. So it transfers that information to the neurons that are going to make up the axons, that are going to make up the spinal nerves to carry information out to the peripheral nervous system. So critically important. Also, so I didn't talk about the lateral horns. The lateral horns, so I talked about motor information and sensory information. But when I was talking about that motor information, I'm talking about the voluntary side of the motor part of our peripheral nervous system, so somatic. The autonomic are over here in the lateral horn. So these are, so same concept, information coming from the brain, but then this is our autonomic. Still going out those same spinal nerves. Exact same concept as the, or I shouldn't say exact same, very similar concept, and we're going to talk about what I mean by that. But this is where the autonomic motor information is integrated, is in the lateral horn. Okay. So, white matter, communication between brain and spinal cord. Gray matter, communication between central nervous system and peripheral nervous system through the dorsal horn and the ventral horn, and then the spinal nerves that leave the dorsal horn and ventral horn. Okay? All right. What's next? Okay. Oh, I had an extra. So I was just going to draw you this visual so you can kind of see. Hopefully it's not absolutely terrible. I'm not the most artistic person in the world, to orient you, hopefully, a little bit more. So if this is our spinal cord, so we've got our gray matter here. Okay, the spinal cord, and I just kind of want to show you how things nest one more time. So the spinal cord is nested in the pia mater, right? So you've got pia mater surrounding the spinal cord. So I'm kind of showing you this if we took each of the layers away one at a time. So you got the pia mater, and then if we went another layer, our next thing is our arachnoid matter. And the arachnoid matter sits directly on top of the pia mater. So our next layer is our arachnoid matter. And then we have the dura mater, but oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. That was wrong. The arachnoid mater does not sit directly on top of the pia mater. The arachnoid mater, there's a space. Ah! It's trying to help me, and that is not helpful. Delete. Okay, there's a space. So there's a space between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater. I apologize. I said that incorrectly. Okay, now we're on track. There's a space between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater. That's the subarachnoid space, and that's where you have cerebrospinal fluid. Then the next layer, this one sits directly on top. So the dura mater then sits directly on top of the arachnoid mater. Stop and think for a second. Each of these structures, these are called the what? What are these that I've just stepped you through? So you've got the spinal cord, and then you've got these 3 layers. What are they called? What are these 3 layers called? Okay, then you have, and I did seriously doubt that I can draw this with anything that looks like what it's supposed to be, but then you have the vertebrae, right? So you have your vertebrae, your vertebral column is your next layer. So we're just going to pretend that that looks something like a vertebrae. Okay, and that's the bone. So these are each of your protective layers. And then emerging out from the spinal cord are your spinal nerves. And your spinal nerves come out from the gray matter, the dorsal horn and the ventral horn. Dorsal is sensory, ventral is motor. Okay? And they integrate information between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so next we'll talk about the brain.